Okay, so get this. Over 117 million people have been displaced from their homes all around the world.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a crazy number, isn't it? And Canada has always tried to do its part, especially with our private refugee sponsorship program.
Right.
But then just recently, the government announced that they're putting a pause on some of those sponsorships.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious to kind of dive into this with
Okay.
you. Like, what's the story here? What's going on?
Well, Canada's private sponsorship program is really unique, actually. It lets everyday Canadians, individuals, groups, organizations, all kinds of people sponsor refugees to come to Canada.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and so these sponsors, they become responsible for things like financially supporting them and helping the newcomers settle in.
I see.
It's a really amazing system when it works, but the problem is it's kind of gotten bogged down.
Okay.
The processing times are now up to like 40 months on average.
Whoa, 40 months. That's like over 3 years.
Yeah.
That's a really long time to wait,
Yeah.
especially when you're talking about people escaping dangerous situations.
That,
I read that the Canadian Council for Refugees, they weren't even given any kind of heads up
yeah.
before this announcement. And they were obviously pretty upset about it.
Mm.
They even used the word betrayal.
Yeah, and I can definitely understand why they would feel that way.
Yeah.
The government's reasoning is that they're facing a huge backlog of applications, almost 250,000 in total.
Oh, wow.
And over 90,000 of those are from private sponsorships.
Oh, wow. So most of them.
Yeah. So they're saying that this pause is necessary to catch up, but obviously it's creating a lot of anxiety and frustration for the people who are affected, directly by it.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you've been working on this for a while now. Tell me, what exactly does this pause mean for people who are trying to sponsor refugees?
So basically, it means that any new applications from groups of 5 or more people,
Okay.
as well as community organizations, they're all on hold.
Okay.
But there is one kind of exception to this rule.
Okay.
Sponsorship agreement holders. And these are organizations that have a proven track record, like the Mennonite Central Committee.
Mm-hmm.
They can actually continue sponsoring refugees.
So it's like there's a two-track system now. Some groups get the green light, and then others are just kind of stuck waiting.
Yeah, it is kind of a confusing situation.
Yeah.
And actually, what's interesting is that the Mennonite Central Committee, which is one of the groups that's still allowed to sponsor refugees, they actually saw this backlog coming.
Really?
Yeah, they actually even suggested raising the number of visas that are issued to help deal with the increased demand.
Wait, so they anticipated this and they tried to like warn the government.
Exactly.
That seems like a pretty key detail.
Yeah.
What was their thinking there?
Well, they saw that applications were like surging, and they understood the strain that it was putting on the system.
Right.
So their proposal was to be more proactive, increase the capacity and keep things moving.
So instead of pausing the system, they wanted to like ramp it up.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's pretty bold.
Yeah.
What did the Canadian Council for Refugees think about that idea?
It's interesting because they actually made a similar request to the government.
Oh, wow.
They asked for a 1-year increase in the number of visas, specifically to clear that backlog.
Okay.
And their argument was that addressing the root of the problem, which is the limited processing capacity, would be much more fair and reasonable than basically just punishing people who are trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, imagine putting in months of work on an application.
Yeah.
Getting all the paperwork together, making all these financial commitments,
Exactly.
only to have it suddenly put on hold.
Yeah.
Indefinitely. Like, it's got to feel like a punch in the gut.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, I read that Lauren Lallement from the council called the government's lack of notice heartbreaking and even used the word callousness.
Yeah, and those are strong words.
Yeah.
But, they reflect the very real emotional toll that this is taking on people,
Yeah.
These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet.
Well.
These are families, individuals with hopes and dreams
Yeah.
who are now stuck in this, bureaucratic limbo.
Absolutely. And this is all happening, in the middle of a global refugee crisis. It's only getting worse each year, right? The number of displaced people just keeps rising.
Unfortunately, yeah.
So what does this pause mean for Canada's role, like on the world stage?
It's a good question.
Especially, as a country that's known for welcoming refugees.
Right. Well, Brian Dyke from the Mennonite Central Committee put it really well. He said that Canada needs to make spaces for these vulnerable populations. The world is watching how we're responding to this crisis.
Right.
And this pause, regardless of the reasons behind it, could send a very chilling message to those who are seeking refuge.
Yeah.
It could also damage Canada's reputation as a humanitarian leader.
Yeah, for sure. So it seems like there are a lot of layers to this issue.
Definitely.
And what I'm hearing is this real tension between this desire to be compassionate
Mm-hmm.
and the limitations of the system that we have in place.
Yeah.
It's like we're trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It really raises the question, is there a way that Canada can balance that urgent need to process the existing backlog
Right.
while also keeping the door open for new sponsorships?
Yeah.
Is there some kind of middle ground?
That's what I want to explore with you. So we've kind of laid out the context of the private sponsorship program,
Right.
the reasons behind the pause and the immediate impacts it's having. But now I kind of want to shift our focus to the bigger picture.
Okay.
So what are the long-term implications of this decision? And are there any alternative solutions that could address both the backlog and the need for continued sponsorships?
It's definitely a tough question to answer,
Yeah.
but I think it's important to remember that Canada isn't alone in this. Like a lot of other countries are facing similar challenges,
Right.
The refugee crisis is a global issue.
Yeah.
And a lot of other nations are actually facing even more strain on their systems than we are.
So you're saying that it's not just about Canada doing its part? It's about working with other countries to try and come up with solutions.
Yeah, exactly. It's a global problem that needs a global response.
But how do you even begin to address something this big?
Well, one place to start might be to look at those alternative pathways that we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
Some experts have suggested looking into community sponsorship models,
Okay.
which can really leverage, existing social networks and resources to help support refugees.
Yeah.
And these models often involve groups of individuals, faith-based organizations, even businesses sometimes,
Oh, wow.
that come together to sponsor and assist newcomers.
So instead of relying only on the government, we give more power to communities to step up and fill the gap.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about empowering people at the local level.
I like that idea. It seems like it could be a more sustainable approach and maybe even a more personalized approach.
Yeah, exactly.
But wouldn't that put a lot of pressure on those communities, especially financially?
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's definitely something that would need to be carefully considered. But you have to also think about the potential benefits. Community sponsorship can foster a much stronger sense of belonging
Right.
and integration for the refugees,
Yeah.
and can also really tap into the amazing generosity and compassion that already exists in so many communities.
It's like that old saying, many hands make light work.
Exactly.
If we spread the responsibility around, it might not feel so overwhelming for any one group.
Right.
So what else are experts saying? What other potential solutions have they come up with?
Another idea that's been proposed is trying to streamline the application process.
Okay.
Right now, it can be very bureaucratic and time-consuming,
Mm-hmm.
lots of paperwork, multiple layers of approval.
Yeah, it sounds like a nightmare.
It can be, yeah. So the idea is if we can simplify the process, maybe even digitize some of it,
Okay.
it could potentially really speed things up without having to sacrifice the due diligence.
Less red tape, more efficiency.
Exactly.
That just seems like common sense to me.
Yeah.
What about this idea of increasing resources for processing the applications?
Right.
The Mennonite Central Committee and the Canadian Council for Refugees both suggested that.
Yeah.
Why not just hire more staff or invest in, better technology?
It might seem like a straightforward solution, but there are a lot of complexities when it comes to government and bureaucracy.
Right.
Increasing capacity requires funding.
Right.
And that often means having to navigate political priorities and budget constraints, which, as you know, is never easy.
Yeah, for sure. And then even if you do get the funding, then you have the challenge of finding qualified people
Exactly.
and making sure that they get proper training.
Yeah, it's a long process.
Yeah. Sounds like there's no easy fix.
Not really.
This pause is really forcing us to confront some hard questions.
Yeah,
About our capacity and our commitment to helping people in need.
for sure.
Is there a risk that this pause just becomes permanent?
It's a concern that a lot of people have.
Yeah.
And it's something we need to be really careful about because the global refugee crisis is not going to just disappear.
Right.
And Canada has a moral obligation to be part of the solution.
Yeah.
I think, though, it's important to remember that this pause doesn't necessarily mean that our values have changed.
Okay.
It could just be that the system is struggling to keep up with the scale of the problem.
So maybe this is like a wake-up call,
Exactly.
an opportunity to rethink our whole approach to refugee resettlement.
I think so.
Maybe instead of making small changes, we need a more fundamental shift in how we think about and manage this whole thing.
Yeah, it might be time for a more systemic overhaul.
We've talked a lot about the systemic challenges, but I also want to talk about the human side of this.
Yeah, of course.
It's easy to get lost in all the policy talk,
Sure.
But we can't forget about the real people whose lives are being directly affected by all of this.
You're absolutely right. At the end of the day, it's about people and
Yeah.
their lives and their futures.
So what about those families, those individuals?
Oh, imagine the frustration and the despair of having your application put on hold indefinitely, not knowing when or if you'll ever be reunited with your loved ones. The
Wow.
emotional toll of that kind of uncertainty is huge.
Yeah, it must feel like being trapped in some kind of bureaucratic maze with no way out.
It's a very difficult situation to be in.
And it's easy to feel powerless,
Yeah.
both for the people who are directly affected and for those of us who are just watching from the sidelines.
Right.
So what can we do? How can we as individuals make a difference when we're talking about a problem this big and this complex?
That's the question that everyone's asking.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to remember that even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Okay.
One thing we can all do is stay informed, educate ourselves about the issues
Well,
and engage in constructive conversations with our families, our friends, our communities.
so knowledge is power.
Exactly. The more we understand, the better equipped we are to advocate for change and to hold our leaders accountable.
Okay, so what else can we do? Are there any practical things that we can do to actually support refugees and, make our voices heard?
Yeah, it can feel really overwhelming when you're dealing with like a global crisis.
Right.
But I think that we can all do something, even if it's just a small thing.
Absolutely. Even small actions can make a difference.
So what kind of things can people do?
Well, one very practical step is to support organizations that are working directly with refugees.
Okay.
There are lots of great groups out there that are doing amazing work.
Right. Yeah.
They provide essential services like legal aid and resettlement assistance,
Right.
or even just basic necessities like food and shelter.
Okay, so donations can definitely make a difference. But I'm also thinking about ways to get involved on a more personal level.
Hmm.
Is there a role for volunteering in all this?
Oh, absolutely. Volunteering is huge. A lot of organizations rely heavily on volunteers to help run their programs and their services.
Okay.
So whether you're helping with language tutoring or job training.
Or even just being a friendly face, offering someone a listening ear.
Yeah.
Volunteers can make a big difference in helping refugees feel welcome and settle into their new lives.
That's a great point. It's not just about giving money. It's about
Mhm.
creating a welcoming and inclusive environment where they feel valued and supported.
Exactly.
And it doesn't have to be like a huge time commitment,
Right.
right?
Oh,
Even
right.
little things can have a big impact.
Yeah, sometimes the most meaningful gestures are the simplest ones, like offering someone a ride to a doctor's appointment,
Right.
or helping out with childcare, or just inviting a newcomer to a community event.
Hmm.
All these things can make a big difference in making someone feel seen and welcomed.
It's about building bridges,
Yeah.
breaking down barriers
Mm.
and just recognizing our shared humanity. I love that, as we've been talking about all of this, it's really struck me that this private sponsorship pause has kind of sparked a much wider conversation
All right.
about Canada's role in the world. It's like it's forcing us to look in the mirror and examine our values and our priorities.
It's a moment of reflection, for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's a good opportunity to really reaffirm our commitment to helping people
Mm-hmm.
and to coming up with solutions that are fair and just and, uphold the dignity and rights of everyone.
Absolutely.
The refugee crisis is a complex issue. There's no doubt about that.
It is.
But it's not impossible to solve.
Yeah.
It requires us to think outside the box, to be creative,
Mhm.
and to work together.
We need to tap into our collective wisdom, our ingenuity, and our willingness to really roll up our sleeves and get things done.
We've talked about all these potential solutions, both at the policy level and at the grassroots level. But I think it all really comes down to this one fundamental question.
Okay.
What kind of world do we want to live in?
It's the big question, isn't it?
Do we want to be a society that turns its back on people in need, or do we want to be a beacon of hope,
Yeah.
a model of inclusivity and compassion?
I think that's a choice that we all have to make.
So what's the one thing that you hope listeners will take away from this conversation?
I hope they feel empowered,
Okay.
knowing that they can make a difference no matter how small.
Yeah.
I hope they leave with more compassion and a commitment to being part of the solution.
Mhm.
And I hope they understand that the refugee crisis isn't just some faraway problem. It's a human challenge
Right.
that affects all of us. And it demands our attention, our action, and our belief in the possibility of a better future.
So well said. This has been a really insightful and thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and helping us break down this really complex issue.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this conversation has given you some new ideas, maybe challenged some old assumptions, and inspired you to take action.
Yeah, get involved.
Remember, change starts with each and every one of us. And in the words of the great Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done.
So true.
Such a perfect note to end on. So, until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. This is The Deep Dive signing off.